Hey, with new tools like ChatGPT EDU, I feel we've all been seeing a particular vision of what educational chatbots might look like. I've been thinking a lot about our pedagogical future, so when Dan Hart reached out to talk about what the state of New South Wales and Australia is doing, I was very excited to learn more. NSWEduChat is the AI powered chatbot designed by the New South Wales Department of Education for students and teachers. I spoke with Dan Hart, the head of AI, and Michelle Michael, Director of Educational Support. Together, they provided great perspective on the technology side of building such a system and the impact of that system on student support and learning outcomes. And now, Dan Hart and Michelle Michael. We're talking to each other from pretty much across the globe, and Dan, you reached out some time ago about what the government of New South Wales is doing and NSWEduChat, which I think is a really interesting, thoughtful take on the role of AI in education. It seems a lot of people right now are thinking about the possibilities for chatbots to do things like personalized education. And so I'm very excited to understand a little bit about how the both of you think about this area. Maybe to start with, I guess I'd love to hear a little bit about how this chatbot came to be.
Yeah, look, I'm Michelle Michael. I'm one of the directors in the department, and the New South Wales Department of Education took the lead coming out of the National Framework for Education, so a federal government framework. It's known as the framework. And it talks in that framework about some guiding principles that education jurisdictions can use around implementing and using AI in their systems. And that includes equity, that it's safe, that it's secure, that students and teachers understand and use AI, but they have that background to how AI might work. So we're using that framework as a really robust start to any of the work that we're doing in AI. And from that, Dan and the team put together, some work on what we've now seen is a safe and secure place for us to test and learn what can be with AI. There are opportunities. It's undoubtable. There are opportunities with AI, but there is also risk. And so this is very much a testing space. And that's where it came from. It really did come from that framework.
Can we start also a little bit with the broader environment that this is all kind of coming into? So what I'm curious about there is how you two think about the current state of education in New South Wales, where that is right now, where you want it to be, and kind of how you're thinking about getting, closing that gap.
Yeah, look, I might jump in there again, Dan, unless there's anything you want to kind of say there. But look, the Department of Education is very progressive. New South Wales is a very forward-thinking, progressive education system. We have very innovative leadership in our secretary and our deputy secretaries and EDs. And so the type of thing that we're seeing and that work and that thinking around AI is not new. Education, the profession, has been through these cycles for decades, eons. And so the profession itself will always rise to what needs to be done for the students and the kids that are in front of them in terms of the teachers and the principals. So look, we're faced with, again, like I said before, with how AI can actually be used effectively in teaching and learning. But we've seen new innovations and new things come into education before. And so those challenges aren't new to our system. Dan, did you want to add anything to that?
Just, I think when ChatGPT came out in November, we initially blocked it for students or restricted it for students because we weren't sure how to handle the consent process. And the fact that student data could be regurgitated in the future from being used for training. So we took a cautious approach. And this is like our first step into understanding, how do students use AI? How do teachers use AI? And of course, the only way you get to do that is by having your own system, because then you get to see the data. There's not another system where you can just go and buy it and then find out how people are using it and how good it is.
I have two questions branching off of things that both of you said, and maybe the one to start with is something that you, Michelle, pointed out, which is that ChatGPT and large language models in general and how they impact education it seems like, as you're saying, this isn't an entirely new thing for educators to be forced with a challenge, something that could exert some influence on the paradigms that we have for educating students. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe in Australia how that's looked, some of the historical context on ways in which educators, from what you've seen, have kind of dealt with these sorts of challenges.
Yeah. So, look, I think if we can jump back a little bit, one of the biggest challenges I think we see with those large language models is how teachers are going to use it, but what drives teaching. And assessment drives teaching very much. How we assess learning, how students learn, how we actually look at what that learning actually looks like. And that may need to change because there has been that background of, you can actually ask students to write an essay, and now that essay can potentially be done by ChatGPT or have a very heavily influence of a large language model. So how we actually assess learning, I now think, is at a critical point. But I don't think that's a bad thing, because we should be looking and should have been looking at not only for us, but even university level, how we actually assess students' learning is now at a critical point. If we look back in history through innovations that have come into the department, this is my 30th year in education.
Wow.
I know, it surprises you as much as it surprises me. But if I think back to when I started teaching in the early 90s, we were using Gestetners, and we've seen evolution of education through digital. I remember having that first Apple computer in my back classroom. Teachers are clever people. Educators are clever people. Principals are clever people. They know what is best for the young people under their care and under their leadership. And they will know how to manage what comes across their desk and what comes across in terms of innovation. And we've seen that, like I said, for the last 30 years that I've been in education, especially in terms of digital. I've been heavily involved in digital in my career, but you can see it learning come to life when things like digital and now AI are used in a productive way for quality teaching and learning. And I think that's the critical piece. And teachers are best placed to understand what that quality teaching and learning looks like for them.
You also said something really interesting earlier, and maybe, Dan, I'd also be curious to get your perspective on how AI chatbots, like the one you're focusing on, really fold into this. But you said something earlier, Michelle, that kind of gestured at this questioning of the ways in which we assess students right now and how those may be more or less effective, and how the technology available to students is going to have a pretty important impact on the ways in which we're able to gauge how much students actually know, how much they're growing, how much they're achieving the things we want them to achieve with the kind of assessments we're used to. I'm wondering contextually as well, just if you feel like that was a direction where you were gesturing at about questioning the style of assessments we do. Teaching to the test is something that we've heard criticized for many, many years at this point, I think. And I'm wondering if you kind of saw this moment that we all just had as kind of a step change where things seem to shift so dramatically that at this point something just had to be done, or maybe how you saw that conversation evolving.
Yeah, Dan, did you want to talk about how the chatbot works in Socratic questioning? Because it's not possible to actually really teach to the test with what Dan and the team have put together.
So I think when ChatGPT came out last year, the immediate news items were our students are going to use this to cheat. And in fact, if you ask, ChatGPT or any of these large language models to write an essay, they will spit out an essay. Those who have used large language models for a while know there's more to it than just asking the question. There's a whole set of structured prompts you need to do to get a good output. So one of the things we wanted to test was, could we make a chat style application available without it regurgitating large amounts of text? And so we've implemented a prompt that, instead of producing large text, instead takes students on a journey through Socratic questioning. So kind of acting like a virtual tutor. So when they ask for that essay on the female characters in Othello, instead of spitting out a very short 3-paragraph essay. It will instead address the question a little bit, but then prompt the student with another question to try and further the understanding. And I was quite concerned when we made that feature that students just wouldn't use it. They would, because at home we've blocked ChatGPT in schools, but of course they can access it from their home computers. But what we're finding is that it's actually proving a little bit addictive to some students. We've got quite a large proportion of them choosing to use it outside of school hours at home because it's entertaining to, be taken through that journey to learn something new.
I think to your question too, you can kind of go down two paths here, I think, as an educator. You can try to aggregate, if you like, for AI. So when you're putting your tasks together to try to think around how you're not going to have AI involved. So verbal presentations, for example, very hard to have AI involved in that. Right? But again, very heavily time. It takes a lot of time if you've got 30 students in front of you to get through 30 verbal presentations on a particular topic, even group work. I think what we're seeing with, again, the work Dan and the team have produced is that teachers are using it as a starting point, not the end point. And I think that is critical, is that when they're putting their questions in around a particular task or a particular thing that the teachers are doing, they're not picking it up and then using that. They're then massaging what is produced to their context. And if we can use large language models in parallel to what is going on in teaching and learning and what is going on in that classroom with the teachers, that I think is going to be the way forward. I don't think it's going to be pure AI or pure large language models. There will always be human and AI, and that is what we're seeing from this test and learn type of process. So I wonder, the way forward is not going to be moving away from having the instruction of the teacher, because we're seeing it in a very different way.
So how do you see then that being divided up, I suppose, where in the classroom you would see the teacher taking care of things, where you think that AI systems are going to be more useful? And perhaps too, one notion that we could dive into as well is the pretty common topic of trust. And what I'm curious about in that regard is not just how do you think about teachers and students trusting the technology they're using, but also about perhaps trusting themselves and their ability to actually understand, engage with, learn properly from those technologies.
Yeah, so we have also developed some professional learning, again, based on that national framework, around for all of our staff to engage with if they want to. It's optional. And it really is that base of what is AI, how does it work, what does it produce, what can it do, what can't it do, hallucinations. So it gives everyone the opportunity to kind of get that baseline understanding of where AI is and what it can kind of do. So that's a really good starting point. There is also some work there that students can then take and start to unpack that as well. One of the critical pieces of that framework that came out from the federal government was people need to understand exactly what that question was that you presented to us. Is what can it do? What are the trust mechanisms? How accurate is what it's producing? How does it actually produce what it's producing? And so when people understand that and they can do that through our professional learning, it's, again, a really good way to start from that baseline thinking. And I think the next part to that question was around, again, comes back to the innovation. You talked around having students have, a chatbot or whatever it might be in their classroom. We're talking about changes to pedagogy, which means that you have a computer open, that a child may be actually typing a question into, the chatbot that Dan and the team have produced. And that's an unusual thing for some teachers. They have not been used to that. And so there is a real change in what needs to sometimes occur in classrooms. And again, our teachers have grappled with that type of thing for decades and come out, I'm really proud of the profession that I work in and that system I work in, because they always rise to what happens and what is needed. And I have no doubt that they'll continue to do that in this case.
I want to get into the what can it do question a little bit more concretely in a second. But before that, I'd love for you to comment on maybe the concrete aspects of the change in classroom, because what this makes me think about is analogs I've heard from folks who are building out systems in other domains that might affect other professions. And so what I'm thinking about here is, for example, a lot of people are building out, say, biomedical technology and chatbots. And the perhaps humanistic, that's a little bit precious sounding, but the goal of that is really to allow doctors to do what they're trained to do instead of having to sink a lot of their time into things like taking clinical notes, for instance. And the eventual goal of some of these systems is then to free up the doctors to interact with the humans, their patients, the people around them. So you have this almost platonic ideal of what it could be to be a doctor. And so let's build a technology around that vision and help the people get there. When you were talking about these changes in the classroom and teachers adapting to these technologies earlier, it made me think of that. And I'm wondering if you also see an analogy there. If you have this platonic ideal of what a teacher could be that you might want to build towards.
Yeah, I feel like I'm hogging this, Dan.
I have some questions for Dan in just a moment.
Let's not make any mistake here. This is high risk work. I still believe that AI work and education has been listed as high risk when integrating AI. You are talking about the integration of work that can change the trajectory and life experiences of young people. So that is not lost on us. It's certainly not lost on me, and it wouldn't be lost on Dan and the team. So you want to make sure that you're going to get it right. As much as you possibly can. So to your question around what it would look like in the classroom, teachers are always going to be, like I said before, front and centre of the decision making for the educational needs of the students that are in front of them at any point in time. Yes, there is an opportunity, as we've discussed earlier, around AI taking away, if you like, some of those tasks that potentially took up some of the teacher's time. But again, those tasks are often very important tasks, and you lift and shift from what is produced by AI without having that human eye over it. I think there is risk in that, big risk. So, and I think the question is really to unpack what are those really important core pieces of work that teachers need to do, and making sure that the AI works in parallel to it, not taking over it, and not the tech ever leading before the teaching and learning. And the tech should not be coming first in any way. And we've seen some big, there is some research out. We look at the great work of Leslie Lobel and her team. There is some strong evidence to suggest that tutoring systems that have AI built into them have produced some great results for students when they have engaged with them long term. But I would say that, again, a lot of what we're seeing is still very early days, and there's still a lot to learn. We get to work with researchers a lot, and there's still not a great amount of research that has been done. It's still a lot of people's conjectures on what they think. So I would suggest New South Wales has gone ahead with a sense of caution, a sense of giving people time and our system time to engage with some of the professional learning that I've just mentioned around what AI actually is and what it can do. And I think that message that has come from our executive has been a wise one, because there's a lot of noise around what this is. But again, I just think we need to take a far more cautious approach. And I'm really comfortable with what we've done, and it's resulted in what I believe is a really high quality piece of work out of Dan's team.
Yeah. Maybe that cautious approach is something that, Dan, you could comment on, actually, as one of the people leading this. the actual, technologists who are building a lot of these systems, there's one thing to, I suppose, theorize and talk about what it is to make human first technology and to think about things in that way. But I think it's entirely another to actually make that concrete and to be the technologist in the room thinking about how you're going to build the things you're trying to build. I'd love for you to comment just a little bit on how that looks for you and your team.
I think product first is what we're thinking. But I'll try and bring it to life with a bit of an example. So when we're thinking about consent processes in school, when we send a consent notice home to parents, typically we get, I don't know, like 30%, 50% of parents respond. And it creates like another administrative workload for teaching staff. So when we were building this, we really wanted to make it something where all the students had access to it. And that kind of helps introduce it into the classroom as well, because then the teachers don't have to effectively run two lessons, one with AI and one without. In fact, that probably would risk the success of the trial, to be honest. So the safety mechanisms we put in so that we could offer this to students without having to ask for consent, instead of sending home a data collection notice to advise parents that we were collecting student data in a different way, were paramount. And then also the level of testing we had to do to be comfortable and get our legal team comfortable that it was an okay thing to do. That cannot be underestimated. And a lot of the content filtering technologies we're using were not really built for content filtering student conversations. They were built for content filtering enterprise conversations, and it's a completely different thing. Getting an algorithm to understand the context of a classroom is proving to be a challenge. So, for instance, sometimes it's okay to talk about violent activities, particularly in like drama that you learn in English lessons in English literature. But most of the time, you don't want to be talking about that level of violence. So, getting AI to understand when it's okay to talk about something and when it's not, effectively the same kind of things you do with children when you're teaching those subjects, is proving difficult. And we're taking a very cautious approach to that right now. So blocking more than I think we would want to.
When you spoke earlier to the level of testing that would kind of bypass the filters, legal teams, things like this, can you speak a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So we have my team, a great team. It's a mixture of data scientists and software developers in the one team. And Michelle's team, very close by, really helps bring that product focus together. I don't think there's a single day that goes by without us talking together and working together. That's quite unusual in government as well, breaking down those silos and really working together on a product. And I think part of the success around how we've moved so fast and made something that's working quite well. But from a testing point of view, it's difficult because this is also new. Like we've got there's experts left, right, and center right now, but effectively we're in a situation where most people have only used this technology for a year. A lot of people, and in Australia as well, very tough to find people who have practical experience of using large language models. So it's proving quite difficult. So we built expertise in the team. So we spend a lot of our time reading, researching, listening to podcasts like yours to keep up to date. And that in itself is almost like a full-time job. And then we've partnered with companies who have traditionally had like a security penetration test type background. And I've been working very closely with them to think up new ways of thinking like a student. And then, of course, we've got our actual students using it. Once we get to a certain point, real students are using it. And that data in itself is very good. We've built a very comprehensive alerting system that allows us to see when any of our filters are triggered. And then our data scientists can zoom in on those conversations and try and work out what the thought processes are for trying to bypass the filters. And that helps too.
Another angle on that question I was curious to explore was benchmarking, which is just a classically hard problem, I think, especially when you are trying to deploy these systems in real world contexts. I recall in reading a little bit about the chatbot, as I think with a lot of similar chatbots, there's the inspiration of being able to bring a teacher home with you. And that's maybe a kind of North Star that you would want to get to. But that does make one think about what are the various things a teacher can do, not just answering questions correctly, but provide context, different analogies to think about a concept, things like this, maybe encourage you if you're feeling a little bit discouraged about what it is you're trying to learn. And so I'm curious how you think about the scope of a system like this, how much of that you want to capture when you are making an analogy like bringing a teacher home with you.
Yeah, so I don't think we're making that analogy. We're firmly positioning this as an assistant for students to get better education. We're not saying it's a replacement for humans at all. In fact, we block conversations with the chatbot that start to approach into that more human side. So if a student asks about their well-being or asks a question that's not related to education, the chatbot will refer them to a trusted adult to have that conversation. And I don't think we're in that position at all. We're firmly looking at education setting stuff, stuff that students learn. Benchmarking, though, oh my goodness, you're completely correct. It's crazy. As a team of data scientists, we have trouble keeping up with new model releases and benchmarking them. How we expect educators to suddenly become data science experts and understand how to read the benchmarks and which tool is right for which purpose, who knows? And that's part of the approach we're taking. So our team has written a custom benchmark. It's based on the subjects that our students learn in New South Wales, along with other things like our policies and the New South Wales syllabus. And I think it consists of about 1,200 questions right now. And we run that automatically on every new language model release that occurs. We're restricted to using models that are available to inference inside Australia right now. So that's another factor.
Yeah, but Dan, I'm going to jump in there. Dan's right that he'll come back to the benchmarking. It was a really good question because, and I'm sorry to bring everyone back to COVID, but when we were in lockdown, it really asked the question and put the question forward of what happens at school, at a bricks and mortar type of environment, and what can happen at home. And I think there is no doubt that you can't have one or the other, right? There are the business of school, the busyness and the socialization that happens in a corridor is equally as important as what goes on in a classroom. And so again, we come back to this point of having both. It isn't one or the other. It isn't having, a teacher or an AI bot. It's always going to be both. But I think one of the benefits of the work that Dan has done is that no longer do you have a back row and a middle row and a front row in a classroom because everyone's in the front row when you're working on something like the work that Dan has done. But it doesn't aggregate what happens in school, the social aspects of school. And I don't think education worldwide has really yet defined what are those really core things that happen at school in bricks and mortar and what can be done in other ways, either online or at home or in other times. And that's something that we really started to interrogate and learn more about during lockdown.
Those are some really interesting distinctions. And Dan, I was glad to hear you kind of call out the wording about bringing a teacher home with you. Actually, the reason I used that wording was I think I pulled that from a quotation that was in a Guardian article about your system. And so I think they actually quoted somebody saying, you can't bring a teacher home with you, which is why that seemed a little bit like inspiration. But that raises a curious point, which is when you're building a system like this, you will get some kind of media coverage. And I remember seeing at least one, perhaps Medium article that actually used very similar wording, where it was talking about you trying to build what you say you're not trying to build, which is something like a teacher that you can take home with you, a chatbot that replaces a teacher or fills in a bunch of their functions. I'm curious, maybe for both of you, how you think about perhaps the risk of there being this gap between what you think what you're building is and then what other people are going to think what you're building is.
I think what people think we're building versus the actual users who are using it, they would know the difference. And we haven't, the people who are writing the articles, they get to see like a short snippet of it in use in a classroom. And that's with the exposure they've had to it. So that could be leading to that reporting. But I think once you use it, you know what it is. And the fact that we have users using it every month, I think shows it's filling a gap right now.
And to that question too, I think there's a lot of hype, like I said, and a lot of noise, and people will jump to it's going to replace a doctor or it's going to replace whatever. In this case, you've just mentioned a teacher. Again, I don't ever think it will. for the reasons we've just discussed, that and you've mentioned that young people need to have that relationship with their teacher, and relationships and culture within a school and within a classroom come first, I think, and then the learning comes from that as well. So yeah, I think there is sometimes in media that jump straight to it's almost the devil's work, and it's going to do certain things that it's not. And so that's what we're seeing in the test and learn environment, that the teachers and the students are using it in a way that is supporting their learning and supporting teaching and learning if you're the teacher, but it's not replacing it.
Let's jump back into the benchmarking part of the conversation we were having a little bit earlier. Dan, one thing you mentioned was the benchmark involving 1,200 different questions that might be, you might want your chatbot to be able to answer pretty well. And I'm wondering a little bit about the process for thinking about that benchmark, the different directions, and I guess this kind of classical question of, you mentioned the kind of Socratic dialogue element that the chatbot engages with. So I'm curious about how you think of this interaction between the way you want the student chatbot interface to look and then the things that you're able to measure with something like a benchmark.
Yeah, the process of the benchmarking is again something that is tricky. It's like when you read the white papers on the large language models, they all use different benchmarks. They use benchmarks that are not Australian based as well. Most of them are American based and talk about the bar and stuff like that. And so we really wanted to develop something that was Australian focused. But the methodology, again, is important. Like our students and teachers are not going to be using 20-shot chain of thought prompting when they interact with our bot. They're going to be 0 shot straight in, ask the question, does it give the right answer back? So our benchmark is 0 shot. Some of the questions are multiple choice, some of them are kind of reasoning based, and understanding policies and syllabus especially. For our syllabus, we prefer verbatim responses of the outcomes and objectives, so that's one of the things we're measuring too. And we also, on our transparency pages, when our subject doesn't measure up, we advise students and teachers to exercise special caution when using those subjects. I think at the moment we advise that for advanced mathematics, obviously, because our models struggle with advanced mathematical concepts at the moment.
And you mentioned that students and teachers are probably not going to be using a lot of crazy prompting techniques. And one thing that I found you'd actually done in order to facilitate something like this was building an auto prompt engineer, which I thought was a really cool idea. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So in our early trials, we found that, we've spent 25 years teaching people to condense all of their thoughts into 2 words to type into Google. And the moment we give people a free text box, that's immediately what they do. They just type in keywords. And as you know, with this new AI, we need to provide lots of context. In fact, the more, the better sometimes. So the opposite of what we've been teaching people. So the auto prompt engineer just detects that right now. It detects, are people using keyword searches? And if it does, it takes those keywords, turns it into a question it could have answered, answers the question, and then kind of teaches the user in the flow that they should stop using keyword searching and revert to sentences. So most of the time, weirdly, it does actually pick the right sentence that it was going to answer. So we're finding quite a lot of success that way. But the purpose of it is to, in the flow, teach people to change the way they're interacting with the system.
And have you found that pretty effective so far?
Yes, but there are other things as well that we're not catching, like the follow-up questions. Getting people are used to typing in something into a computer, getting back an answer that is definitely correct. And if it's not correct at the moment, they tend to walk away because there's no point doing the same thing again, because in most computer systems, you get the same response back. But with this, we're trying to encourage people to have a conversation. So if it's not the correct answer, then ask follow-up questions or add more reasoning into what you were thinking. And so trying to encourage that behavior is quite tricky. And we don't want like the first experience of someone using the system to type something in, get a wrong answer, and then never use it again. So part of the PL that Michelle's team has developed helps with that process. But then also we've got prompts inside the system. We have special buttons that populate to suggest the next question they should ask, or when they first log in, an example question, just to start to encourage people into this conversation kind of mode.
Do you find that the deployment of the system thus far and some of what you're talking about right now, it seems like you've set up some fairly clear boundaries about where these systems and the people using them kind of need to meet in the middle, if that makes sense. Like, you don't want to take the chatbot and adapt it all the way to where the person already is, just the way they're used to asking questions and expecting answers, because you do want to coax somebody to maybe be a little bit more thoughtful and to engage in something more like a Socratic dialogue. But then at the same time, you probably don't want the chatbot just sitting there as it is and to bring the person and make them just totally get used to whatever the system offers. From what you were just saying, it sounded like you'd drawn some fairly clear principles on that, but I'm wondering if you two feel like you've figured that out in a broad sense.
They're definitely not figured it out for sure. We're learning new stuff every day. One of the best things about this is that it is so open. So teachers and students using it every day, we get to see all kinds of things that we would never have dreamed they would use it for. And that really helps us work out what to do next. And I don't think we'd ever want to be in a position where we tie it down so it's so restrictive that creativity doesn't exist. But at the same time, getting this kind of creativity is unusual and can cause some concern the first time you use it. The probabilistic nature means that you don't always get the same response back, and trying to teach people that has been quite amusing. Like, people have said, it's not working today because it's giving a different answer than it did yesterday. Usually the answers have the same information in, they're just phrased differently, but people are just not used to seeing this kind of response back from computers, and that's been quite challenging. I think we've probably could have phrased that better in our PL, but that's something we can build on and learn from. That's been the fun part about this.
What are some of those things that you mentioned earlier? People had been using the system in ways that you'd never dreamed. What are some of those things?
Yeah, so look, when we first brought it up, we were thinking of getting the teachers in to show them some sample ways of using it. But again, our colleagues in the Secondary Principals Council, they advised us. They said, look, the professional work out how to best use it. And so I was in a school last week, one of the pilot schools, the trial schools, and they had put in a list of students, and they were putting together then some potential homework examples that they could do for each of those students against their interests. So, student A had an interest in Marvel, student B had an interest in, Pokemon, student C had an interest in cats, and it was able to produce something and just some examples of what that teacher could produce, send home for homework for those kids based on their interests. And he just said it did it in 30 seconds. It would have taken me hours to come up with those ideas. Critically, he said, I didn't need to use all those ideas, but they were exactly that, just ideas for me to take on board for each child. And those type of things are unheard of. It doesn't mean that it's going to be everything that's produced by the chatbot is what he's going to use. But it gave him so many potential, teaching and learning ideas to meet the students' needs. And I think it comes back to what we've kind of discussed, is that when it's well designed, which is what we've done here with teachers, for the profession, with the profession. It hasn't been developed by just a group of technologists. Our team we're in Ed Standards, we're in teaching and learning, and so we're listening to the profession around how this works and making tweaks through Dan's team. And then it's well used. So where it's supported in that use. We did give some sample lessons, which teachers could use with their students if they wanted to, on Dan's work and the team of Dan. And then I think also critically, it's well governed, this work. So it's not just someone's good idea. This has come from a very strong strategic and a good policy place from that federal government framework, because too often we see a panacea, a tech panacea to a problem that it's silver bullet, and it just isn't going to do that. So I've gone through a lot of tech things in my time, and I will say I think this is one of the best processes that I've ever been involved in, because it's doing those things quite well. So when it's used in the right hands, in the right way, we have a better chance of having better, like really good outcomes for kids. And I think that's what we've seen here. Where the teacher-led instructions of the product that we've produced here with Dan and the team, the quality of the tool produces what we need our teachers to have the opportunity to produce.
I want to spend some time on the governance theme. I personally really like hearing cautionary tales, and I'm curious, Michelle, if you can think of any previous instances that you've seen personally experienced where you mentioned that what we've got right now with the chatbot that Dan's team is building, things are pretty well managed, well governed, but what are some cases you've seen where things didn't quite go so well?
Things come and go. We've seen that throughout history, of particularly in edtech. And they say they're going to do things, and they just don't. I mean, that's unless they're in the hands of a quality educator. And I sound like I'm harping on about it a bit, but the quality of the teacher and then the quality of the teaching are the most critical things that will come from any tool or anything that a teacher uses. And so if I think back through, I've not seen as much hype as I've seen with AI in probably the last 2 years, maybe except for when we released, iPads came around. And I think back to that time in, where iPads were going to change and revolutionize education, and was going to do all of these amazing things. And it's not only iPads. We saw it with, I remember having that handheld Walkman, and, you're going to be able to listen to your university things on a tape. Well, it didn't happen. Okay, so again, those cautionary tales of what we've learned from, we seem to sometimes not learn from history. And so, when ChatGPT landed and really, really took off, there was an element of whole education systems almost going in a little blind, and maybe some criticism of being unprepared. But I still think the department, and particularly under the really good guidance of our executive, did the right thing in just stepping back and remembering that under their own usage agreement at the time, ChatGPT wasn't supposed to be used by anyone under 18. So, there were some critical things that we made some decisions on there to give people some thinking time, because jumping in and giving access to something that we didn't know a lot about, how it would work, how teachers would work, not giving teachers any background on AI, the nuances of large language models, I think it was good that the department didn't do that. And if I had my time over, I wouldn't have changed anything. I think that it was a really good move. I think there were times where we were criticised for doing that, because you've always got those willing people that, look, it can do this. We can see how it's working. We really want to have a go at using this. Why is this not available to our young people? But it's probably, I think there's an element of sometimes being a little bit ill-informed. When things are going well, they're going well. But when they don't go well, and our data privacy and our safety of our young people's data is so critical, more critical than any other time in history. And that data can be surfaced in different ways when it's used inappropriately through those large language models. So I think that when people started to understand in our system the risks and weigh it up with the opportunities and the benefits, and then produce what we've produced internally in our tenant, I think that was the best way forward.
That's really interesting, because it sounds like before going through everything you just said, I could imagine somebody thinking about how would a Department of Education and an educational system cope with a new technology like this. And one of the important things you said earlier is that there's a level of hype going on right now that is at a level of intensity that maybe just wasn't there before. And so you could wonder, is that actually going to produce a uniquely bad outcome? But from everything you're saying, it seems like you all managed to address things in the right way and kind of allow the requisite space for thinking to produce what sounds like has become a uniquely good outcome.
Yeah, look, I think that's really accurate. And keep in mind, we're one of the biggest organisations in the Southern Hemisphere. We're not talking about a school of 2,000 students with maybe 2,000 adults there. We're talking around hundreds of thousands of students and teachers. And so when you're doing something at scale, like I said before, it needs to be right. It needs to be well thought through. It needs to be governed. You need to have an understanding of what potentially it can be, the results of what you're about to do, and again, that support needs to be there. The hype is still pretty high. And I think there was, I remember talking to people that were in other other systems of education, saying, "Oh, people are going to be left behind if you don't get on board." Well, I still think there is a time to really understand, be really critical consumers of this, and our teachers and our young people and our school leaders need time to actually understand the possibilities of what this can do, and we need to, as a system, support them in doing that. So, I think the department's done well. I'll be honest in that.
Dan, I'm wondering if you can comment to your team's experience of that governance, because when I think about that, one thing that often happens in an American discourse about governance and technology is we see these things as kind of polar opposites, and people will gesture at the EU and say, there's the big governments over there that are hampering all this technological development, and we don't do that. I'm wondering, you spoke earlier about the fact that you've been able to operate with speed and effectiveness. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that experience has looked like for you.
And it's entirely breaking down silos and right-sizing governance. So our governance panel is for executive directors from different areas of expertise, and they meet very frequently. So once a week they meet and they govern the project. Like, I don't think I've ever worked on a project in government where the governance committee meets that frequently, and I think that's been part of the secret to it. Inside the team, it's like a startup. We've got all the skills of the people we need inside the team, so we don't have to go outside of the team too much for stuff, which has also helped with speed.
I think we learned that also through COVID, is that this is not a tech issue. AI and a large language model, this isn't a tech issue. If anything, I think as we move forward, there needs to be more voices involved in what this looks like, and more voices involved in AI around ethics, around teaching and learning. And so that governance that Dan just talked about, our EDs, we have people that are involved in legal and compliance, we have cyber, we have teaching and learning, we have tech. So they come together because not one silo owns any of this. And so joining that all together, again, a very rare thing that sometimes doesn't happen well in government, has happened really well here. And so that's why, like Dan and our team, the teaching and learning team, and even the cyber team, we work very, very closely together. And I haven't had that before in any of the tech programs of work that I've managed.
How do you think about being able to preserve those qualities going forward? The thing you mentioned about bringing in more voices and people who might want to comment on things, one might think about that and maybe expect that could involve something like more process or more waiting on people having to balance more different concerns, which probably on its own sounds like a really, really good thing. But also, if you're the technologist who is trying to build the technology to deploy in places, that person might feel slowed down. I don't mean to make a normative judgment one way or the other on whether it's good to be moving at a certain speed or not, but I'm curious how you think about getting to the place you want to be in terms of governance and then balancing that with the technologist experience of what they're building.
I think when you're building a first version of a product, it's great to have that speed and have everything in the team, but that's not sustainable long term, and certainly not in a government system. So already our team is switching to involving more of the other technology teams, finding owners for different parts of the technology, and kind of like operationalizing what we've built, if that's the direction we decide to take it in. So I think it works well for a first version of product. I think would burn everyone out and upset a lot of people if we continued like this long term too.
Yeah, Dan's right. I guess if there was any advice, we need to use the muscle of the system. We have smart people and really competent people in our system. And what I've seen in other organizations and corporations, they'll often stand up, and I see them advertised all the time in job ads, an AI team, an AI lead, an AI, and they'll be a single team to do a single, product build outside at arm's length almost from everyone else. We just don't have that luxury, as Dan said. It's just not sustainable. And so using and standing up people that have and the teams that can bring what's needed into the conversation from the start means you can work at pace because you have everyone in those meetings and in those conversations early. And so the ethics are the cyber and the data security issues are discussed. So you're not having to have a stand-up team with a person that's in charge of teaching and learning, and then having to go and speak to the rest of the people in the system around teaching and learning around large language models and AI. So, I think that was, again, a really wise way that the executive put this together.
You also said something earlier about having really good teachers and educators and putting this technology in their hands and seeing them operate with it being a pretty important component of seeing something like this through and making it go well. And I'm curious how you think about identifying the people that you really want to be part of something like this, both on the technology side, but then also the other voices you need there when you're deploying it.
Do you want to talk about the tech team, Dan, before, and then I'll talk about it?
Yeah, sure. Picking the tech team is very tricky. So we recruited July last year was the first members of our team. So like ChatGPT had been around since November. So really hard to go out and find like experts in a small market in this field. So rather than recruiting for expertise, we were kind of recruited for personalities and like habits. So people who build their own things. I think that's a common thing in startup land as well. People who enjoy building things and are passionate about it. They're really like the first sets of people in our team. And having data scientists and software engineers in the same team as well, really important. Coming up with a way that for that to flow together. Data science is slower, experimental, so the timelines can be a bit grey sometimes. So coming up with a pipeline of data science churning through that, and then software engineers can pick up and rapidly iterate on in sprints has been quite important to the team too. But generally, enthusiasm, like enjoying the build, is what we've been recruiting for.
And so my team, I have they are very skilled people. Not a great big team. We're not talking about huge numbers with either Dan's team or my team, but they are very skilled educators. They understand the teaching and learning cycle really well, and very experienced in quality teaching and what that looks like in a classroom. But I think it's important with the type of, when you mention, who do you want to trial this work? Sometimes when you go out for a pilot or a trial and you ask schools to be involved, they'll send it straight to the tech person. I used to be a school leader, and when something would come into my inbox around a pilot or a trial with technology, it would be sent straight to the technology people that are interested in it. And the messaging that we took out to our schools is, again, it's optional. Teachers can use this when they decide and see fit to use it. They didn't have to use it for a certain period of day, and they didn't have to use it for a certain time. But it really was for everyone. There was benefits here for the experienced teachers, the new scheme teacher that was out for a year or two, and our new leaders and our experienced leaders. So everyone brings knowledge to this at every point in their career, and we've seen that. We've seen that through that test and learn environment, and it means different things to different people that are involved in education. I think that's a really critical point too.
I'm wondering if, especially from a student's perspective, and maybe I'm asking you to try to inhabit somebody else's mind here a little bit. Do you feel at all that the integration and use of technologies like this in the classroom, especially when you get to maybe a more advanced point where you figured out some of the things you're currently trying to figure out, do you feel that changes at all what it means to be a good teacher? Or do you think that maybe it amplifies some aspects of what makes teachers good already?
We've got teaching standards in New South Wales, and the teaching standards, one of the first dot points is know your students and know how they learn. And I think that's important that it says know your students and know how they learn, but it doesn't say with technology or with a book or with a piece of sporting equipment. Those things are not add-ons, but they can, when they're used properly by a really amazing teacher, it can bring learning to life. And so I would say that the great work that's already happened in this area, and again, there's another team over in ITD in digital teaching and learning, they've done some really critical work over the last few years to support what you've just said, that if you integrate technology effectively and put it in the hands of great teachers, it can put learning on steroids. But it's no different from terrible, boring work in a textbook. It's still terrible, boring work in digital, right? So again, it's around the quality of our teaching and our people. And I don't think even with large language models and AI, that's ever going to change.
I'm curious if articulations like this or kind of visions of that sort for you, Dan, because you were talking earlier about the ways in which you try to embed their frequent meetings with people from the government and a lot of people who you try to bring into the conversation when you think about the technology you're building and work on it. And so I'm curious if that picture that Michelle just painted of teachers and some of these teaching standards, if that kind of factors in constantly as you're building your systems or what that looks like.
Yeah. So my team is not made up of teachers. In fact, our last experience of school was quite some time ago. So having direct access to teaching staff is essential to creating something that's going to work. Sure, just like making any product. But then, of course, like having it in a trial gives you unparalleled feedback. When you're building something for a customer that also works for the same organization, you have a level of access to your customer that is really useful for building a product. And the fact also that we're storing this conversation data and they can then use AI to analyze it adds another level of analytics and potential for improvement on top of that. You don't get, like, from mouse clicks in a system, you can't really infer too much, but from actual conversations, you can infer quite a lot.
Have you found any particularly interesting things from conversation data and other things you've been recording so far?
Yeah, our number one requested feedback, and I hope you don't take offense to this, is American English versus Australian English. Almost all of the large language models default to using American English first. Obviously, this is a teaching system, so we want to be teaching our students Australian English or British English. And I think we'll probably touch on this a bit later on, but the most popular model used behind the scenes, because we're using a bit of a mixture of models, is ChatGPT 3.5. It's notoriously difficult to get it consistently to produce American English. So our data scientists have been working on lots of different ways to try and remove the American English and replace it with Australian English. But it's tricky because naturally this is something you'd want to do with AI. Doing keyword replacement can be strange. So if you ask for American English response to talk about the differences between American English and Australian English, and using keyword replacement, you just kind of flush replace everything with Australian English. So it's actually proving to be quite tricky. I think that hadn't even occurred to me because I'm so used to using Zs in code and color without a U. I kind of speak American English without realizing it.
American English is a little weird in lots of ways, to be fair. You did mention the multiple model approach that your system uses, and I do think that's really interesting. Your website describes this orchestrator layer that you can use different knowledge sources with, and then also this constitutional alignment portion of the system. And I'm wondering if you can break that down a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the orchestrator came about for two main reasons. The first one is a mixture of equity and price. So in public education, we have equity issues all over the place, but the large language models kind of bring a new dimension to equity because it's not just those who have technology versus those that don't. We now have different levels of quality of technology. For instance, students that can afford a subscription to ChatGPT get GPT-4, which is better than those that can't afford a subscription and get GPT-3.5. As a public education system, we can't afford to use GPT-4 for everything. It's like 12 times the cost per token or per word. And so we were looking for a way that we could affordably bring in GPT-4 when it was needed, but not for everything. So our benchmark helps with that. It identifies the subjects that GPT-3.5 doesn't do very well in. And then the orchestrator, it's a BERT classifier, just works out the probability of the question being asked is one of the subjects that we want to switch to GPT-4. And then we seamlessly behind the scenes send it GPT-4. And then later on in that same conversation, if the student or teacher is not talking about mathematics, for instance, it will go back to GPT-3.5. So even in a conversation, we're switching backwards and forwards. And that's also allowed us to use a retrieval augmentation for something. So we're using our policy library. I can't remember how many policies, we've got quite a few. So when we the orchestrator detects the questions about policy, we send that to a RAG-enabled model behind the scenes. And the same for extracting syllabus objectives and outcomes so that we don't get hallucinations in those. We refer directly to the syllabus documents. And we see in conversations a complete mixture of these models being used for different messages as people bring in bits of information, maybe get some information about healthy canteens and goes to the policy RAG model, turn it into an email, goes to ChatGPT 3.5, asks for a translation, maybe goes to GPT-4 for some languages. That kind of mixture behind the scenes is what's going on. So it helps us from an equity point of view because it means we're able to provide like GPT-4-ish quality to students, but without having to pay GPT-4 for everything. And I think Michelle mentioned earlier on, we have hundreds of thousands of students. So if we were to scale this further than our trial, cost is definitely going to be one of the things that will prevent us from doing that.
And on the other end of that, when you're delivering your answers to students, one of the things you point out again is that you would want to align those answers with certain standards or maybe filter out certain content or get kind of squeeze out any American English if you can find it. And so the constitutional element of that is kind of interesting. And I'm wondering if you can dig a little bit into how you think about the value alignment perspective and what that looks like.
Yeah, so I think we've got, I can't remember, like quite a lot of filters going on the way. At least 7 filters on the inputs and 2 on the outputs. But we've got such a vast amount of conversation data in this trial that we wanted a way for us to be able to find conversations that we had missed with those filters so that we could improve them. And it's actually quite difficult to do that without reading all the conversations, which we didn't want to do, or writing AI to analyze them, which is also not entirely accurate all the time. So we built a prompt that basically assesses values of the responses that the bot gave. So we're running this on the output from whichever model gets run. We ask it to consider the values of public education and whether the responses were not paying attention to those values. We don't use that to do any live blocking, but we use that as a way for our data scientists to find conversations that maybe aren't responding in the way that we would like. And then it gives us another level of feedback that we don't get just from looking at the blocked filters.
And is this like a list of values that you've worked out internally that you're telling it assess the response you just gave, or that you're looking at along these lines? Or can you tell me a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, so these values, actually, we're very lucky. We have a policy about values in public education. So it's a direct copy of that policy document. So the same values that we would expect our schools and teachers to have when dealing with students. So the values we're applying to the model too.
Do you find that in the responses that maybe you've looked at or that other people have looked at, do you feel like the system does a pretty good job of aligning responses with those values? Or do you think there's any gap remaining? How do you think that looks right now?
Well, we built this out, I think, out of an abundance of caution because we didn't know what was going to happen because no one has done this before. And what we're finding is we're not actually seeing many results that come back from the models that are an issue because the models are so well human aligned already that it's not really a massive problem.
You were talking earlier about the difficulty of filtration and the fact that, again, you're being a little bit more conservative than you'd like to be, especially if you're thinking about cases like the example. I think maybe this was Michelle's example, but where it might be appropriate to talk about violence in the classroom context, but since it's kind of hard to differentiate between that, you may do more filtering than you might want to. And so, from the perspective of you're working off of these chatbots that are already aligned and might be a little bit more, these systems that are already like pretty aligned, do you think there's room for moving in a direction where they might be a little bit more adversarial, for instance, when it comes to the ways they interact with students? And I don't mean in a way that could potentially be dangerous, but just in terms of, challenging the student to think through something, for example. I'm curious if that's something that you're thinking about, or like what that looks like for you.
I think from a content filtering point of view, I'm comfortable with where we are because we want this trial to be a success. And if that means some conversations don't happen that probably could have, I think that's a better place to be in than the opposite right now. What's becoming apparent is that that we need a school-focused content filtering algorithm. And large language models on their own do a pretty good job of working out whether something could be spoken about in school or couldn't. So that could be a potential source, but they're slow and expensive. So I don't like throwing large language models at a problem because at scale can be quite expensive. So it's definitely an area we're looking into. And we're in a fortunate position now to have lots of data to be able to start that exploration.
The kind of final sets of questions I had for you both was around continuing on this theme of gaps between where the system is right now and maybe the educational infrastructure around it and where you want it to be. One area that I think is important to think about here is the equity component that you all spoke about earlier, where you might want to be able to offer more personalized instruction support, and especially for students who maybe don't have as much help available at home for the types of educational challenges they're going through. A system like this could be really helpful. And Dan, you also raised the part of just having more money to pay for something like ChatGPT Pro. I'm wondering how you two think about how far the system you have today gets us and where you ultimately want to be.
Look, I draw from some of the work out of industry professor from the Paul Ramsey Foundation, Leslie Lobel, and that paper that she's produced. It shows that there is a risk around that digital divide that we saw again during COVID, widening even further for the students, the haves and the have-nots. I've seen it termed as the new poor. And it's a real risk, I think, as we move forward. But what we've done here, what Dan's team has done, is that when students walk into our New South Wales government schools, they have access to high quality digital work, high quality products, high quality teaching, high quality resources. And when they go home, at the moment we can't influence that. But what can we influence? We can influence what what happens when they come into our schools. And that's why I think that we play a really important part here in what that looks like. That said, I think that that digital divide, I know that across other government agencies in New South Wales, they're working really hard at trying to address that. They recognise that coming out of post-COVID, there was we've got some very good colleagues in other parts of Department New South Wales, Telco, for example. I know they're working at looking at how to actually bridge that digital divide. So it's not that it's not there, but it's certainly something that as a society and as a system, we're going to need to look at as we move forward.
You pointed out multiple junctures throughout this conversation. It's not purely a technological problem, but there are some, I suppose, pretty clear ways in which technology can exacerbate certain components of it. A last question I'll ask you too, before I let you go, is there is this quotation that came up in the Guardian article I mentioned earlier that I think came from a student about the chatbot system that you've been working on. And it kind of harkens to something you mentioned earlier, the way that students have access to other technologies outside the classroom. And I pulled it out just because it was interesting. It said, when we're out of the classroom, as much as there's blockers, we still have access to ChatGPT and resources that aren't pushing us to be the students we could be. The last part of that sentence stuck out to me, pushing us to be the students we could be, because I feel like that's a very nice summary of what it feels like the ideal version of the system could kind of push towards and paint. And so I'm wondering how you two think about that component. We've talked about ensuring access, ensuring, making teachers better at what they do, or helping really good teachers continue to be really good. How do you think about that question of students becoming the students they could be, and how your system interacts with that?
It's an interesting comment from that young person. But, my survey of two, having two teenagers myself, sometimes I think teenagers and kids don't know what they need to know. And so my answer to that is students need to understand, they need an understanding of information, right? And that knowledge then allows them to build knowledge on that knowledge. They need to, in its simplest terms, they need to know stuff to be able to be critical thinkers and critical users of that stuff, right? So, which is why that human-centric AI, I think, is the way forward. Because it's going to support students thinking and critically analysing what is produced from an AI bot. But if you don't have that core understanding and knowledge of what is produced, how can you critically analyse it? Right? So there's never been a more important time to have knowledge and understanding and have that explicit teaching of that in the first instance. But this type of work and this AI work that Dan and the team have done can support and supplement that. And I don't disagree. It can help young people be, move to the next level, if you like. But you've got to have some core understanding of what it is you're asking and what it is you're critiquing, because otherwise you could be critiquing something that actually is produced by AI that isn't actually right, and you don't actually know that. You've got to get to those sources and different sources to make sure that it's true. So, there's never been a more important time for our educators and explicit teaching in the classroom to give them that knowledge.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Michelle, Dan, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to my guests, Dan Hart and Michelle Michael. If you like this, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider spreading the word a bit or leaving a rating. I say this pretty much every time, but it really helps a lot and hopefully doesn't take up too much of your time, so I'd appreciate it.